Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Kristen, Katrina, Makanai, and John. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you are interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, collections, and some upcoming giveaways for the holidays, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we complete a series of listener requests that were won in a giveaway some months ago, and I apologize that this one has taken so long, but I think you'll love it, because the request is for more from Henry David Thoreau. So tonight, let's relax in the Maine woods. First copyrighted in 1864 by Tickner and Fields, and republished in 1906 in the Collected Writings of Henry David Thoreau by Houghton, Mifflin and Co. I promise I'll be doing my best with these Maine words, but apologies to anyone if I get them wrong. Let's begin. Introductory note. The Maine Woods was the second volume collected from his writings after Thoreau's death. Of the material which composed it, the first two divisions were already in print. Katahdin and the Maine Woods was the title of a paper printed in 1848 in the Union Magazine, and Chesuncook was published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1858. The book was edited by his friend William Ellery Channing. It was during his second summer at Walden that Thoreau made his first visit to the Maine woods. It was probably in response to a request from Horace Greeley that he wrote out the narrative from his journal, for Mr. Greeley had shown himself eager to help Thoreau in putting his wares on the market. In a letter to Emerson, January 12, 1848, Thoreau writes, "I read a part of the story of my excursion to Katahdin to quite a large audience of men and boys the other night, whom it interested. It contains many facts and some poetry." He offered the paper to Greeley at the end of March, and on the 17th of April, Greeley responded, "I enclose you $25 for your article on Maine scenery as promised. I know it is worth more, though I have not yet found time to read it, but I have tried once to sell it without success. It is rather long for my columns and too fine for the million, but I consider it a cheap bargain and shall print it myself if I do not dispose of it to better advantage. You will not, of course, consider yourself under any sort of obligation to me, for my offer was in the way of business, and I have got more than the worth of my money. But this generous, high-minded friend was thinking of Thoreau's business, not his own, for in October of the same year he writes, "I break a silence of some duration to inform you that I hope on Monday to receive payment for your glorious account of Katahdin and the Maine woods, which I bought of you at a bargain and sold to the Union magazine. I am to get $75 for it, and as I don't choose to exploit you at such a rate, I shall insist on enclosing you $25 more in this letter, which will still leave me $25 to pay various charges and labors I have incurred in selling your articles and getting paid for them, the latter by far the most difficult portion of the business." The third of Thoreau's excursions in the Maine woods was made very largely for the purpose of studying Indian life and character in the person of his guide. He had all his life been interested in the Indians, and Mr. Sanborn tells us, what is also evident from his journal, that it was his purpose to expand his studies into a separate work on the subject, for which he had collected a considerable amount of material from books as well as from his own observations. After his return from the Allagash and East Branch, he wrote as follows to Mr. Blake under date of August 18th, 1857. "I have now returned, and think I have had a quite profitable journey, chiefly from associating with an intelligent Indian. Having returned, I flatter myself that the world appears in some respects a little larger, and not as usual, smaller and shallower for having extended my range. I have made a short excursion into the new world which the Indian dwells in or is. He begins where we leave off. It is worth the while to detect new faculties in man. He is so much the more divine, and anything that fairly excites our admiration expands us. The Indian who can find his way so wonderfully in the woods possesses so much intelligence which the white man does not, and it increases my own capacity as well as faith to observe it. I rejoice to find that intelligence flows in other channels than I knew. It redeems for me portions of what seemed brutish before. It is a great satisfaction to find that your oldest convictions are permanent. With regard to essentials, I have never had occasion to change my mind. The aspect of the world varies from year to year, as the landscape is differently clothed, but I find that the truth is still true, and I never regret any emphasis which it may have inspired. Katahdin is there still, but much more surely my old conviction is there, resting with more than mountain breadth and weight on the world, the source still of fertilizing streams, and affording glorious views from its summit if I can get up to it again." The Maine Woods, Katahdin. On the 31st of August, 1846, I left Concord in Massachusetts for Bangor and the backwoods of Maine, by way of the railroad and steamboat, intending to accompany a relative of mine, engaged in the lumber trade in Bangor, as far as a dam on the west branch of the Penobscot, in which property he was interested. From this place, which is about 100 miles by the river above Bangor, 30 miles from the Holton Military Road, and 5 miles beyond the last log hut, I propose to make excursions to Mount Katahdin, the second highest mountain in New England, about 30 miles distant, and to some of the lakes of the Penobscot, either alone or with such company as I might pick up there. It is unusual to find a camp so far in the woods at that season, when lumbering operations have ceased, and I was glad to avail myself of the circumstance of a gang of men being employed there at that time in repairing the injuries caused by the great freshet in the spring. The mountain may be approached more easily and directly on horseback and on foot from the northeast side by the Aroostook Road and the Wassataquock River, but in that case you see much less of the wilderness, none of the glorious river and lake scenery, and have no experience of the bateau and the boatman's life. I was fortunate also in the season of the year, for in the summer, myriads of black flies, mosquitoes, and midges, or as the natives call them, no-see-ums, make traveling in the woods almost impossible. But now their reign was nearly over. Katahdin, whose name is an Indian word signifying highest land, was first ascended by white men in 1804. It was visited by Professor J. W. Bailey of West Point in 1836, by Dr. Charles T. Jackson, the state geologist, in 1837, and by two young men from Boston in 1845. All these have given accounts of their expeditions. Since I was there, 2 or 3 other parties have made the excursion and told their stories. Besides these, very few, even among backwoodsmen and hunters, have ever climbed it, and it will be a long time before the tide of fashionable travel sets that way. The mountainous region of the state of Maine stretches from near the White Mountains northeasterly 160 miles to the head of the Aroostook River and is about 60 miles wide. The wild or unsettled portion is far more extensive, so that some hours only of travel in this direction will carry the curious to the verge of a primitive forest, more interesting perhaps on all accounts than they would reach by going 1,000 miles westward. The next forenoon, Tuesday, September 1st, I started with my companion in a buggy from Bangor for up river, expecting to be overtaken the next day night at Mattawamkeag Point, some 60 miles off, by 2 more Bangorians who had decided to join us in a trip to the mountain. We had each a knapsack or bag filled with such clothing and articles as were indispensable, and my companion carried his gun. Within a dozen miles of Bangor, we passed through the villages of Stillwater and Old Town, built at the falls of the Penobscot, which furnished the principal power by which the Maine woods are converted into lumber. The mills are built directly over and across the river. Here is a close jam, a hard rub at all seasons, and then the once green tree, long since white, I need not say as the driven snow, but as a driven log, becomes lumber merely. Here your inch, your 2 and your 3-inch stuff begin to be, and Mr. Sawyer marks off those spaces which decide the destiny of so many prostrate forests. Through this steel riddle, more or less coarse, is the arrowy Maine forest from Katahdin and Chesuncook and the headwaters of the St. John, relentlessly sifted, till it comes out boards, clapboards, laths, and shingles such as the wind can take, still perchance to be slit and slit again, till men get a size that will suit. Think how stood the white pine tree on the shore of Chesuncook, its branches soughing with the four winds, and every individual needle trembling in the sunlight. Think how it stands with it now, sold perchance to the New England Friction Match Company. There were in 1837, as I read, 250 sawmills on the Penobscot and its tributaries above Bangor, the greater part of them in this immediate neighborhood, and they sawed 200 millions of feet of boards annually. To this is to be added the lumber of the Kennebec, Androscoggin, Saco, Passamaquoddy, and other streams. No wonder that we hear so often of vessels which are becalmed off our coast, being surrounded a week at a time by floating lumber from the Maine woods. The mission of men there seems to be, like so many busy demons, to drive the forest all out of the country, from every solitary beaver swamp and mountainside, as soon as possible. At Old Town, we walked into a bateau manufactory. The making of bateaux is quite a business here for the supply of the Penobscot River. We examined some on the stocks. They are light and shapely vessels, calculated for rapid and rocky streams, and to be carried over long portages on men's shoulders, from 20 to 30 feet long, and only 4 or 4.5 wide, sharp at both ends like a canoe, though broadest forward on the bottom, and reaching 7 or 8 feet over the water, in order that they may slip over rocks as gently as possible. They are made very slight, only 2 boards to a side, commonly secured to a few light maple or other hardwood knees, but inward are of the clearest and widest white pine stuff, of which there is a great waste on account of their form, for the bottom is left perfectly flat, not only from side to side, but from end to end. Sometimes they become hogging even after long use, and the boatmen then turn them over and straighten them by a weight at each end. They told us that one wore out in 2 years, or often in a single trip on the rocks, and sold for $14 to $16. There was something refreshing and wildly musical to my ears in the very name of the white man's canoe, reminding me of Charlevoix and Canadian voyageurs. The bateau is a sort of mongrel between the canoe and the boat, a fur trader's boat. The ferry here took us past the Indian island. As we left the shore, I observed a short, shabby, washerwoman-looking Indian, just from upriver, land on the Old Town side near a grocery, and drawing up his canoe, take out a bundle of skins in one hand and an empty keg or half-barrel in the other, and scramble up the bank with them. This picture will do to put before the Indian's history, that is, the history of his extinction. In 1837, there were 362 souls left of this tribe. The island seemed deserted today, yet I observed some new houses among the weather-stained ones, as if the tribe had still a design upon life, but generally they have a very forlorn and cheerless look, being all backside and woodshed, not homesteads, but instead of home or abroadsteads, for their life is domi aut militiae, at home or at war, or now rather venatus, that is, a hunting, and most of the latter. The church is the only trim-looking building, but that is not Abenaki. That was Rome's doings. Good Canadian it may be, but it is poor Indian. These were once a powerful tribe. Politics are all the rage with them now. We landed in Milford and rode along on the east side of the Penobscot, having a more or less constant view of the river and the Indian islands in it, for they retain all the islands as far up as Nicoteau at the mouth of the East Branch. They are generally well timbered and are said to be better soil than the neighboring shores. The river seemed shallow and rocky, and interrupted by rapids, rippling and gleaming in the sun. We paused a moment to see a fish hawk dive for a fish down straight as an arrow from a great height, but he missed his prey this time. It was the Holton Road on which we were now traveling, over which some troops were marched once towards Mars Hill, though not to Mars Field as it proved. It is the main, almost the only road in these parts, as straight and well made and kept in as good repair as almost any you will find anywhere. Everywhere we saw signs of the great freshet, this house standing awry, and that where it was not founded, but where it was found at any rate the next day, and that other with a waterlogged look, as if it were still airing and drying its basement, and logs with everybody's marks upon them, and sometimes the marks of their having served as bridges strewn along the road. We crossed the Sunkays, a summary Indian name, the Aleman, Passadumkeag, and other streams, which make a greater show on the map than they now did on the road. At Passadumkeag, we found anything but what the name implies. Earnest politicians, to wit, white ones I mean, on the alert to know how the election was likely to go. Men who talked rapidly, with subdued voice, and a sort of facetious earnestness you could not help believing, heartily waiting for an introduction, one on each side of your buggy, endeavoring to say much in little, for they see you hold the whip impatiently, but always saying little in much. Caucuses they have had, it seems, and caucuses they are to have again, victory and defeat. Somebody may be elected, somebody may not. One man, a total stranger, who stood by our carriage in the dusk, actually frightened the horse with his asseverations, growing more solemnly positive as there was less in him to be positive about. So Passadumkeag did not look on the map. At sundown, leaving the river road a while for shortness, we went by way of Enfield, where we stopped for the night. This, like most of the localities bearing names on this road, was a place to name, which in the midst of the unnamed and unincorporated wilderness was to make a distinction without a difference, it seemed to me. Here, however, I noticed quite an orchard of healthy and well-grown apple trees in a bearing state, it being the oldest settler's house in this region, but all natural fruit and comparatively worthless for want of a grafter. And so it is generally lower down the river. It would be a good speculation, as well as a favor conferred on the settlers, for a Massachusetts boy to go down there with a trunk full of choice scions and his grafting apparatus in the spring. The next morning we drove along through a high and hilly country in view of Cold Stream Pond, a beautiful lake 4 or 5 miles long, and came into the Holton Road again, here called the Military Road, at Lincoln, 45 miles from Bangor, where there is quite a village for this country, the principal one above Old Town. Learning that there were several wigwams here on one of the Indian islands, we left our horse and wagon and walked through the forest 1/2 mile to the river to procure a guide to the mountain. It was not till after considerable search that we discovered their habitations, small huts in a retired place, where the scenery was unusually soft and beautiful, and the shore skirted with pleasant meadows and graceful elms. We paddled ourselves across to the island side in a canoe, which we found on the shore. Near where we landed sat an Indian girl, 10 or 12 years old, on a rock in the water in the sun, washing, and humming a song meanwhile. It was an aboriginal strain. A salmon spear, made wholly of wood, lay on the shore, such as they might have used before white men came. It had an elastic piece of wood fastened to one side of its point, which slipped over and closed upon the fish, somewhat like the contrivance for holding a bucket at the end of a well pole. As we walked up to the nearest house, we were met by a sally of a dozen wolfish-looking dogs, which may have been lineal descendants from the ancient Indian dogs, which the first voyageur described as their wolves. I suppose they were. The occupant soon appeared, with a long pole in his hand with which he beat off the dogs while he parleyed with us. A stalwart but dull fellow, who told us in his sluggish way in answer to our questions, as if it were the first serious business he had to do that day, that there were Indians going up river, he and one other, today before noon. And who was the other? Louis Neptune, who lives in the next house. Well, let us go over and see Louis together. The same doggish reception, and Louis Neptune makes his appearance, a small, wiry man with puckered and wrinkled face, yet he seemed the chief man of the two, the same as I remembered who had accompanied Jackson to the mountain in 1837. The same questions were put to Louis, and the same information obtained, while the other Indians stood by. It appeared that they were going to start by noon with 2 canoes to go up to Chesuncook to hunt moose, to be gone a month. Well, Louis, suppose you get to the point to the 5 islands, just below Mattawamkeag, to camp. We will walk on up the West Branch tomorrow, 4 of us, and wait for you at the dam on this side. You overtake us tomorrow or next day and take us into your canoes. We stop for you, you stop for us. We pay you for your trouble. Yet, replied Louis, maybe you carry some provision for all, some pork, some bread, and so pay. He said, I'm sure to get some moose. And when I asked if he thought Pamela would let us go up, he answered that we must plant 1 bottle of rum on the top. He had planted a good many, and when he looked again, the rum was all gone. He had been up 2 or 3 times. He had planted letter, English, German, French, etc. These men were slightly clad in shirt and pantaloons, like laborers with us in warm weather. They did not invite us into their houses, but met us outside, So we left the Indians, thinking ourselves lucky to have secured such guides and companions. There were very few houses along the road, yet they did not altogether fail, as if the law by which men are dispersed over the globe were a very stringent one, and not to be resisted with impunity or for slight reasons. There were even the germs of one or two villages just beginning to expand. The beauty of the road itself was remarkable. The various evergreens, many of which are rare with us, delicate and beautiful specimens of the larch, arbor vitae, ball spruce, and fir balsam, from a few inches to many feet in height, lined its sides, in some places like a long front yard, springing up from the smooth grass plots which uninterruptedly border it, and are made fertile by its wash, while it was but a step on either hand to the grim, untrodden wilderness, whose tangled labyrinth of living, fallen, and decaying trees only the deer and moose, the bear and wolf, can easily penetrate. More perfect specimens than any front yard plot can show grew there to grace the passage of the Holton teams. About noon we reached the Mattawamkeag, 56 miles from Bangor by the way we had come, and put up at a frequented house still on the Holton road, where the Holton stage stops. Here was a substantial covered bridge over the Mattawamkeag, built, I think they said, some 17 years before. We had dinner, where, by the way, and even at breakfast as well as supper, at the public houses on this road, the front rank is composed of various kinds of sweet cakes, in a continuous line from one end of the table to the other. I think I may safely say that there was a row of 10 or a dozen plates of this kind set before us too here, to account for which they say that when the lumberers come out of the woods, they have a craving for cakes and pies and such sweet things, which there are almost unknown, and this is the supply to satisfy that demand. The supply is always equal to the demand, and these hungry men think a good deal of getting their money's worth. No doubt the balance of victuals is restored by the time they reach Bangor. Mattawamkeag takes off the raw edge. Well, over this front rank, I say, you coming from the sweet cake side, with a cheap philosophic indifference though it may be, have to assault what there is behind, which I do not by any means mean to insinuate is insufficient in quantity or quality to supply that other demand of men, not from the woods, but from the towns, for venison and strong country fare. After dinner, we strolled down to the point formed by the junction of the two rivers, which is said to be the scene of an ancient battle between the Eastern Indians and the Mohawks, and searched there carefully for relics, though the men at the bar-room had never heard of such things. But we found only some flakes of arrowhead stone, some points of arrowheads, one small leaden bullet, and some colored beads, the last to be referred perhaps to early fur trader days. The Mattawamkeag, though wide, was a mere river's bed, full of rocks and shallows at this time, so that you could cross it almost dry-shod in boots. And I could hardly believe my companion when he told me that he had been 50 or 60 miles up it in a bateau, through distant and still uncut forests. A bateau could hardly find a harbor now at its mouth. Deer and caribou or reindeer are taken here in the winter in sight of the house. Before our companions arrived, we rode on up the Holton Road 7 miles to Molunkus, where the Aroostook Road comes into it, and where there is a spacious public house in the woods called the Molunkus House, kept by one Libby, which looked as if it had its hall for dancing and for military drills. There was no other evidence of man but this huge shingle palace in this part of the world, but sometimes even this is filled with travelers. I looked off the piazza round the corner of the house up the Aroostook Road, on which there was no clearing in sight. There was a man just adventuring upon it this evening in a rude, original, what you may call Aroostook wagon, a mere seat, with a wagon swung under it, a few bags on it, and a dog asleep to watch them. He offered to carry a message for us to anybody in that country cheerfully. I suspect that, if you should go to the end of the world, you would find somebody there going farther, as if just starting for home at sundown, and having a last word before he drove off. Here, too, was a small trader, whom I did not see at first, who kept a store, but no great store certainly, in a small box over the way, behind the Molunkus signpost. It looked like the balance box of a patent hay scales. As for his house, we could only conjecture where that was. He may have been a boarder in the Molunkus house. I saw him standing in his shop door. His shop was so small that if a traveler should make demonstrations of entering in, he would have to go out by the back way and confer with his customer through a window about his goods in the cellar, or, more probably, bespoken and yet on the way. I should have gone in, for I felt a real impulse to trade, if I had not stopped to consider what would become of him. The day before, we had walked into a shop over against an inn where we stopped. The puny beginning of trade, which would grow at last into a firm co-partnership in the future town or city. Indeed, it was already Somebody and Co., I forget who. The woman came forward from the penetralia of the attached house, for Somebody and Co. was in the burning, and she sold us percussion caps and knew their prices and qualities, and which the hunters preferred. Here was a little of everything in a small compass to satisfy the wants and the ambition of the woods, a stock selected with what pains and care, and brought home in the wagon box or a corner of the Holton team. But there seemed to me, as usual, a preponderance of children's toys, dogs to bark, and cats to mew, and trumpets to blow, where natives there hardly are yet, as if a child born into the Maine woods among the pine cones and cedar berries could not do without such a sugar man or skipping jack as the young Rothschild has. I think that there was not more than one house on the road to Molunkus, or for 7 miles. At that place we got over the fence into a new field planted with potatoes, where the logs were still burning between the hills, and pulling up the vines found good-sized potatoes, nearly ripe, growing like weeds, and turnips mixed with them. The mode of clearing and planting is to fell the trees and burn once what will burn, then cut them up into suitable lengths, roll into heaps and burn again. Then, with a hoe, plant potatoes where you can come at the ground between the stumps and charred logs. For a first crop, the ashes sufficing for manure, and no hoeing being necessary the first year. In the fall, cut, roll, and burn again, and so on, till the land is cleared, and soon it is ready for grain and to be laid down. Let those talk of poverty and hard times who will in the towns and cities. Cannot the emigrant who can pay his fare to New York or Boston pay $5 more to get here? I paid $3 all told for my passage from Boston to Bangor, 250 miles, and be as rich as he pleases, where land virtually costs nothing, and houses only the labor of building, and he may begin life as Adam did. If he will still remember the distinction of poor and rich, let him bespeak him a narrower house forthwith. When we returned to the Mattawamkeag, the Holton stage had already put up there, and a province man was betraying his greenness to the Yankees by his questions. Why province money won't pass here at par, when states money is good at Fredericton, though this perhaps was sensible enough. From what I saw then, it appears that the province man was now the only real Jonathan, or raw country bumpkin, left so far behind by his enterprising neighbors that he didn't know enough to put a question to them. No people can long continue provincial in character who have the propensity for politics and whittling and rapid traveling which the Yankees have, and who are leaving the mother country behind in the variety of their notions and inventions. The possession and exercise of practical talent merely are a sure and rapid means of intellectual culture and independence. The last edition of Greenleaf's Map of Maine hung on the wall here, and as we had no pocket map, we resolved to trace a map of the lake country. So dipping a wad of tow into the lamp, we oiled a sheet of paper on the oiled tablecloth, and in good faith traced what we afterwards ascertained to be a labyrinth of errors, carefully following the outlines of the imaginary lakes which the map contains. The map of the public lands of Maine and Massachusetts is the only one I have ever seen that at all deserves the name. It was while we were engaged in this operation that our companions arrived. They had seen the Indians fire on the 5 islands, and so we concluded that all was right. Early the next morning we had mounted our packs and prepared for a tramp up the West Branch, my companion having turned his horse out to pasture for a week or 10 days, thinking that a bite of fresh grass and a taste of running water would do him as much good as backwoods fare and new country influences his master. Leaping over a fence, we began to follow an obscure trail up the northern bank of the Penobscot. There was now no road further, the river being the only highway, and but half a dozen log huts confined to its banks to be met with for 30 miles. On either hand and beyond was a wholly uninhabited wilderness stretching to Canada. Neither horse nor cow nor vehicle of any kind had ever passed over this ground. The cattle and the few bulky articles which the loggers use being got up in the winter on the ice and down again before it breaks up. The evergreen woods had a decidedly sweet and bracing fragrance. The air was a sort of diet drink, and we walked up buoyantly in Indian file, stretching our legs. Occasionally there was a small opening on the bank, made for the purpose of log rolling, where we got a sight of the river, always a rocky and rippling stream. The roar of the rapids, the note of a whistler duck on the river, of the jay and chickadee around us, and of the pigeon woodpecker in the openings, were the sounds that we heard. This is what you might call a brand new country. The only roads were of nature's making, and the few houses were camps. Here, then, one could no longer accuse institutions and society, but must front the true source of evil. There are three classes of inhabitants who either frequent or inhabit the country which we had now entered. First, the loggers, who for a part of the year, the winter and spring, are far the most numerous, but in the summer, except a few explorers for timber, completely desert it. Second, the few settlers I have named, the only permanent inhabitants, who live on the verge of it and help raise supplies for the former. Third, the hunters, mostly Indians, who range over it in their season. At the end of 3 miles, we came to the Matassiunk stream and mill, where there was even a rude wooden railroad running down to the Penobscot, the last railroad we were to see. We crossed one tract on the bank of the river of more than 100 acres of heavy timber, which had just been felled and burnt over and was still smoking. Our trail lay through the midst of it, and was well nigh blotted out. The trees lay at full length, 4 or 5 feet deep, and crossing each other in all directions, all black as charcoal, but perfectly sound within, still good for fuel or for timber. Soon they would be cut into lengths and burnt again. Here were thousands of cords, enough to keep the poor of Boston and New York amply warm for a winter, which only cumbered the ground and were in the settler's way, and the whole of that solid and interminable forest is doomed to be gradually devoured thus by fire, like shavings, and no man be warmed by it. At Crocker's log hut, at the mouth of Salmon River, 7 miles from the point, one of the party commenced distributing a store of small scent picture books among the children to teach them to read, and also newspapers, more or less recent, among the parents, than which nothing can be more acceptable to a backwoods people. It was really an important item in our outfit, and at times the only currency that would circulate. I walked through Salmon River with my shoes on, it being low water, but not without wetting my feet. A few miles farther we came to Marm Howard's, at the end of an extensive clearing, where there were 2 or 3 log huts in sight at once, one on the opposite side of the river, and a few graves even, surrounded by a wooden paling, where already the rude forefathers of a hamlet lie, and 1,000 years hence, perchance, some poet will write his elegy in a country churchyard, the village Hampdens, the mute inglorious Miltons, and Cromwells, guiltless of their country's blood, were yet unborn. Perchance in this wild spot there will be laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. And with that rather curious poetic interlude, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. I do love these old travelogues, whether on sea or land, and it seems you do too, so I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, and there is a great deal left to go, as always, I'll leave a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.